The strategic rivalry unfolding across the Indo-Pacific entered a new phase at the 2026 Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where Philippine Secretary of National Defense Gilberto Teodoro Jr. delivered some of his strongest remarks yet on China's regional behavior while forcefully defending Japan against accusations of new militarism. His comments came amid rising tensions in the South China Sea, growing concerns about Taiwan, and an increasingly visible alignment among countries seeking closer security cooperation across the region. The exchange quickly became one of the most closely watched moments of the annual Security Forum, highlighting the widening divide between competing visions for the future of Asia. For years, China has criticized Japan's expanding defense posture, arguing that Tokyo is moving away from its post-war pacifist principles. Chinese officials and military representatives have repeatedly warned against what they describe as a revival of Japanese militarism. However, Japanese leaders argue that their military modernization is a response to an increasingly challenging security environment, particularly China's rapid military expansion and growing pressure on neighboring states. At the center of the debate was Japan's current defense minister, Shinjiro Koizumi, who used the Shangri-La Dialogue to reject accusations of militarism and defend Japan's record as a responsible member of the international community. He pointed to China's expanding military capabilities and questioned the logic behind Beijing's criticism of Tokyo. The remarks drew support from Teodoro, who argued that Japan was being unfairly targeted and misrepresented. According to Teodoro, there is a fundamental contradiction in China's criticism of Japan. He suggested that the country making the accusations possesses vastly greater military capabilities than the nation it is accusing. He argued that regional countries should focus on observable actions rather than political narrative, as the Philippine defense chief described the accusations against Japan as an example of selective criticism and said many countries in Asia have benefited from Japan's decades-long commitment to peace, development, and international cooperation. He emphasized that Tokyo's post-war conduct should be judged by its actual behavior over the last several decades rather than by rhetoric. His intervention was significant because it reflected a growing willingness among regional governments to publicly support Japan's larger security role. For much of the post-war era, Japan maintained strict limitations on military activities. Those restrictions were shaped by historical experience and constitutional constraints. In recent years, however, Tokyo has gradually expanded defense spending, strengthened military partnerships, and increased cooperation with countries such as the Philippines, Australia, and the United States. China views many of these developments with suspicion. Japan argues they are necessary. The Philippines increasingly appears to agree with Tokyo. This shift did not happen overnight. Over the past several years, Manila has experienced repeated confrontations with Chinese vessels in disputed areas of the South China Sea. Incidents involving Coast Guard ships, maritime militia vessels, and naval forces have intensified concerns within the Philippine government about long-term security risks. As a result, the Philippines has accelerated defense cooperation with partners across the region. Japan has emerged as one of the most important of those partners. Defense equipment transfers, maritime security assistance, intelligence cooperation, and joint exercises have all expanded significantly. The relationship now extends well beyond diplomacy and into practical security coordination. Against that backdrop, Teodoro's defense of Japan carried considerable weight. He argued that claims of Japanese militarism ignore reality and overlook the broader regional security pie. Instead of focusing on Japan's defensive modernization, he suggested attention should be directed toward actions that have generated concern across multiple countries. The discussion quickly widened into a broader debate about military transparency and regional stability. One of the recurring themes throughout the Shangri-La Dialogue was transparency. Several participants raised concerns about the pace and scale of China's military buildup. While Beijing has every right to strengthen its armed forces, critics argue that limited transparency surrounding military expansion creates uncertainty among neighboring countries. Japanese officials highlighted this issue repeatedly during the forum. They argued that rapid military growth combined with increasingly assertive behavior in disputed waters naturally raises questions among regional governments. The Philippines shares many of those concerns. Teodoro pointed to ongoing maritime disputes and emphasized that security challenges can be addressed simply through public statements. Trust, he argued, is built through consistent actions. The South China Sea remains the most visible example of those tensions. For more than a decade, competing territorial claims have produced diplomatic disputes, Coast Guard confrontations, and military incidents. The Philippines continues to cite the 2016 arbitral ruling that rejected the legal basis of China's expansive maritime claims. China rejects that ruling and maintains its own position. The disagreement remains one of the most significant flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific. At the Shangri-La Dialogue, Teodoro reminded participants that 2026 marks the 10th anniversary of the arbitration decision. He stressed that the ruling reinforced the principle that maritime rights derive from international law rather than historical narratives. For Manila, the issue is not simply about territorial disputes. It is about preserving a rules-based international order. Philippine officials in Crete Azingli framed the South China Sea debate as a test of whether international law can protect smaller nations when disputes arise with larger powers. That perspective has become a central feature of Philippine foreign and defense policy. The debate over Japan's role cannot be separated from this larger context. As tensions have increased, countries throughout the region have sought stronger partnerships and more robust deterrence. Japan has responded by expanding security cooperation. The Philippines has responded by welcoming it. The United States has reinforced alliance commitments. Australia, Canada, and several European countries have increased their presence in regional security discussions. Together, these developments are reshaping the strategic landscape. China, however, sees many of these trends differently. Chinese officials argue that external powers are fueling confrontation and creating unnecessary divisions. Beijing maintains that regional disputes should be managed through dialogue and bilateral engagement. Following Teodoro's comments, Chinese officials reacted sharply. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning criticized the Philippine defense chief and accused him of undermining bilateral relations. Beijing also rejected his characterization of Chinese intentions and disputed his assessment of regional security issues. The exchange underscored how sensitive these issues have become. What once might have been limited to diplomatic statements is now increasingly taking place in highly public international forums. For observers, this reflects a broader trend. Countries that previously avoided direct criticism of China are becoming more willing to voice concerns openly. The Philippines is among the most prominent examples. Teodoro's remarks also touched on another important theme: strategic resilience. He argued that smaller countries cannot simply wait for major powers to resolve their differences. Instead, they must strengthen their own capability as in partnerships. That philosophy has become increasingly visible in Philippine defense planning. Military modernization programs are accelerating. New partnerships are emerging. Defense cooperation agreements are expanding. Infrastructure projects tied to security requirements are moving forward. The objective is straightforward: build enough resilience to deter coercion while maintaining the ability to cooperate with partners when necessary. This approach mirrors trends elsewhere in the region. Countries from Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia are investing more heavily in defense capabilities than they were a decade ago. Many governments believe the security environment is becoming more complex and less predictable. The Taiwan Strait remains a major concern. The East China Sea continues to generate tensions. The South China Sea remains contested. Against that backdrop, security cooperation is increasingly viewed as a necessity rather than a choice. Teodoro's comments reflected this reality. He suggested that stronger cooperation among like-minded nations contributes to stability rather than instability. Supporters of this view argue that credible deterrence reduces the risk of conflict because it raises the cost of aggressive actions. Critics contend that expanding military partnerships can intensify competition and increase mistrust. Both arguments were evident throughout discussions in Singapore, yet one message emerged clearly: the strategic balance in Asia is changing. Countries are reassessing assumptions that guided regional policy for decades. The Philippines is doing so, Japan is doing so, Australia is doing so, many Southeast Asian governments are doing so. The debate is no longer about whether the security environment is changing. It is about how countries should respond. For Teodoro, the answer appears clear. Partnerships matter, deterrence matters, international law matters. And narratives, he argues, should be measured against facts. As discussions continued at the Shangri-La Dialogue, participants repeatedly returned to questions of trust, transparency, and credibility. Those themes are likely to remain central to regional security debates for years to come. The controversy surrounding Japan, China, and the Philippines is ultimately about much more than a single speech or a single diplomatic dispute. It reflects a larger struggle over the future security architecture of the Indo-Pacific. Will the region be shaped primarily by power politics? Will international law remain the central framework for resolving disputes? Can competition be managed without escalating into confrontation? Those questions remain unresolved. What is clear is that governments across Asia are making decisions now that will influence the regional balance for decades. The Philippines believes stronger partnerships are essential. Japan believes a greater security role is necessary. China believes its actions are justified and that criticism is unfair. These competing perspectives are driving one of the most important geopolitical debates of the modern era. And as the exchanges in Singapore demonstrated, that debate is becoming increasingly direct, increasingly public, and increasingly consequential for the future of the Indo-Pacific. As regional leaders departed the Shangri-La Dialogue, the headlines focused on sharp exchanges, competing narratives, and diplomatic friction. Yet beneath those headlines lies a deeper reality. Nations across the Indo-Pacific are preparing for an era in which security, sovereignty, and strategic competition will remain defining issues. The remarks by Gilberto Teodoro Jr. were therefore not merely a response to criticism of Japan. They were a reflection of a broader strategic shift taking place across the region. A shift driven by concerns over security, questions about deterrence, and a growing determination among many countries to shape their own future rather than simply react to the decisions of larger power. Says that conversation is far from over. In many ways, it is only beginning.